Hi everybody, welcome to the English Lab's Texts in 10 videos where we aim to equip you with some really insightful ideas and some new ways of thinking about your comparative pairs. My name is Ben Taylor and today I'm going to take you through what we feel are the three main things that are going to help you get to a deeper understanding of the pairing of the namesake and reckoning. And so let's jump in. Idea number one, the first thing that we want you to think about when it comes to these texts is looking at the individual and how the individual is impacted by the world around them. Of course, with these texts, we have very clear main characters. Of course, with an autobiography, we've got Magda Szubanski, and then we have Gogol, and the way in which the story revolves around his experiences and what happened before his birth and then throughout his life. I will make a note here in saying that you need to make sure that you're looking at the experiences of all the characters and that you're looking to go further than just looking at Gogol and Magda and their fathers. But of course, that's going to be a part of everything that you come across when you're looking at these two texts, but always keep an eye out for things that we can analyse that go beyond just those things. However, with this first idea of identity, we need to look at what shapes a person and this idea of being an individual and how they are shaped by things such as culture, the past and history, and then trauma as well. And so rather than just pointing out that those three things all impact upon an individual, we need to look at the ways in which they do it. So we can start from a point where we can talk about how we have these characters that are similar in the way that they are shaped by the world around them, but then we can start to look at the differences in the ways in which these characters are shaped by those types of things. So when it comes to things like culture, we need to start thinking about the different ways in which these characters are moulded by that. Of course, Gogol has this very strong sense of culture in his house as he grows up, as opposed to Szubanski, who was very aware of her father's Polish heritage, but she must, ask questions about it in order to get more things out of him. So we'll discuss that in a little bit further detail later on. When we're going to look at going beyond the surface, we can look at things like assimilation. And so we can look at the ways in which we can see some differences there. In the case of the Gangulis, they are able to assimilate to America and they look to provide their children with some quintessential American experiences. The Christian holiday of Christmas being a fantastic example of that, and that commercial idea of gift giving and so on that is obviously very American. And so they do involve their children in that, but they have this hybrid party on Christmas Eve where the Bengali family is invited over. It's a fantastic way of seeing how a person can be molded by the culture that they're growing up in, such as Gogol is growing up in at school, and then the culture that they have at home and how these things can meld together and frame a person in a certain way. The way that I want you to think about this idea though is about looking at the individual and all of the things that happen to them that change who they are as people and how they see themselves. When it comes to Szubanski, one of the really intriguing ideas that she brings up is that idea of things that have predated her birth having an impact on who she is as a person. And this idea that trauma is something that can be handed down to children, the trauma of the parents and things that they have gone through. Of course, we can see a link there with the namesake and what has happened to Gogol's father before his life and how that has changed who he is and how Gogol sees himself as a person as well. But then, of course, we need to be saying more than just the fact that both the texts say the same thing. If we get to the end of an essay and we've got a person who's just said that both of these texts essentially say the same thing, then we haven't gone really far with our thinking. So that's where we start to tease out the different ideas about the ways in which that trauma or that culture or the past of a parent can have an impact and the different ways that these people are impacted. And that's where your most insightful thought is going to come from. I think when it comes to this, when we're also looking for differences, we need to go further with the idea of assimilation. I mentioned before about the way in which the Gangulis look to assimilate to America, but still hold on to their roots in India and in Bengali culture. We can see that in a stark contrast to someone like Peter Szubanski, who basically sheds himself of his history in order to try and overcome it and to get past it. What's very interesting about Szubanski's experience is that he seems to adopt all of these quintessentially Australian behaviours, the driving of the Triumph, the being involved in the local tennis club down at Croydon, and this idea of him mowing his suburban backyard up on the hill in the heat. But we understand that he doesn't love all of those things. Rather, it is this case of him trying to take on a new identity in this new country as a way of trying to shed himself of his past and what was there beforehand. Of course, he doesn't completely do this, and they do have Polish friends, and he does return to Poland. But it is worth noting that there are those people who will hold on to the past that they had before them and the culture that was there. And then there's men like Szubanski, who is a man who had given up on isms, and that the trauma of everything that had happened to him before had led to him seeking a new life. And so that leads us nicely into our second idea. And the idea that I want to look at here is the idea of rejection and acceptance, and the many different ways that we see this throughout either of these stories. And when we look at this, we can see that rejection and acceptance is all a part of the journey of how these characters come to understand who they are. Of course, in The Namesake, we have Gogol changing his name to Nikhil, which forms a major conflict of the entire story, but also is a major step in his identity and forging his own identity as a person. These things happen in a very deliberate way for Gogol, in the way in which he changes his name when he moves to college and becomes this new person. And so we can see this as a rejection of who he is, quite literally rejecting his name and changing it. And also as a rejection of the way in which he's been brought up and the way in which he looks to become someone new. Throughout his experiences at college, we then see him move on to having the holiday with Maxine. And if you go back and you read through this section when he is at the lake and he's on holidays with Maxine's parents, you can start to see some very negative feelings towards his parents. And the way in which he looks at them is in this very pessimistic view, and he becomes somewhat ashamed or embarrassed of their frugal and conventional way of living in comparison to the way in which Maxine's parents lived their life. However, there's never an outright rejection of his parents or of culture. Sure, he comes to be embarrassed and somewhat ashamed of them, but he always comes back to them. He also notes that he was never more than a train ride away from home, so that as much as he may have looked to move beyond the childhood home and how his parents had brought him up, there was something that was still there that drew him back. What's really interesting about this is that we see with his relationships, he goes on to marry Mashumi. And if we were to look at this in this very optimistic light, we could see this very simple message of Gogol rejecting certain parts of his culture only to come back and to accept them and to live happily ever after. Of course, we understand that that is not the case with his marriage to Mashumi. And so this idea that who a person is and what they reject and what they accept is something that changes them as a person and something that is constantly evolving. When it comes to Szubanski, we have things such as her brief tennis career, and for a moment there it seems like her obsession with sport and with tennis is this link to her father and a really strong forging of her identity. Of course, in those scenes where she shows that she lacks that killer instinct and she loses that connection with her father, she ends up rejecting that part of herself and never picking up a tennis racket again. Of course, this also has the extra dynamic that Szubanski can bring to this when she begins to suppress certain parts of herself when it comes to her sexual identity. And the way in which she doesn't understand or that she is fearful of some of the things that she is feeling adds a further dimension to this idea of the things that people reject or accept about themselves. As we watch Szubanski grow up and learn to come to terms with these types of things, we understand that who she is attracted to and the way that she feels about these things is something that she will hide from, something that she will reject, something that she will come to accept, and something that takes a very long time for her to be able to feel truly comfortable with. And so as we look at this, we start to look at the way in which these people are made up of all of these different things, some of which they're very accepting of, some of which they reject, some of which they suppress within themselves. But ultimately, that it's a case where it is a journey to them fully understanding themselves. And what's most telling about this is that when we look to understand others as well, people like Szubanski still have questions about her father, even years after his death. And so that this understanding of who we are can be somewhat understood, but ultimately is something that shifts and changes to a point where people are never going to have a full resolution and a fully resolved idea of exactly who they are. And so our third idea, and now we're going to look at identity, and we've already covered certain aspects of that with the first two ideas that we looked at. And I'm sure that if you've looked through any study guides or done some research online, when you look at these two pairs, the word identity is going to come up a lot. But as I've mentioned before, we need to make sure that we're delving deeper than just the identification of a theme that exists between these two texts. So we need to be able to open up this idea so that we can get to some more insightful comparisons and analysis. And the first couple of things that we can ask ourselves are, how do others perceive us and how do we perceive ourselves? And what impact does that have on our identity? So when we start to look at this, we can realize that there are characters that go through many phases in their life. And it's really telling that the namesake actually starts with the story of Ashima. And that even though it goes on to mostly be the story of Gogol, who becomes Nikhil, that the story actually begins with the things that predate his birth. And so we have this story of Ashima being this terrified young woman in a hospital in a foreign land, and then we go back in time to hear the story of how she came to be Gogol's mother. When we look at that as well, we can look at the phases of Magda's life as well. That she was the convent girl, that she was the girl who took to secondary school and was doing very well academically, only to then leave that all behind and to find herself in a place where she was no longer successful academically, where depression and anxiety and these things started to come into her life. And so as we look at that, we have those quotes about her being the convent girl during the week and the pretend sharpie on the weekend. And so how Magda perceives herself and how others perceive her is wrapped up in this idea of her searching for a sense of identity. And the fact that she refers to herself as a pretend sharpie is quite telling, in that she knows that that's not completely who she is, but she is so unsure of who she is that it's a case of her being on that search for a sense of true identity. Where we can start to draw some differences with the namesake is if we look at Gogol, rather than it being about groups that he looks to fit in, what starts to define Gogol and how he comes to understand himself is the relationships that he has, particularly the romantic relationships with women. And so each of these women show Gogol different sides of himself and different things that he comes to understand about himself and his parents and the way in which he wants to live his life. As we mentioned before, when it comes to Mashumi, this is not the answer to all of Gogol's questions about his identity and who he feels he should be. And with the relationship ending up in crisis and with them separated by the end of the text, we are further given this idea that who we are as people and how we identify and how we perceive ourselves is an ever-changing principle, and that it's the idea of how we see ourselves is a shifting thing, something that moves throughout time. And so in summary, where we want to be with this is looking at the key ideas of these texts, but the different experiences of the characters and therefore the different values and ideas that are being put forward by Lahiri or Szubanski in the way in which they're saying things about the nature of identity, culture, trauma, the past, and all of those things. We can look at acceptance and rejection and suppression of our own selves, and we can look at how that can have a great molding on who the person is. Essentially, underneath all of this, when it comes down to identity, have a think about the person that exists there and all of the different things that have a major impact on them and the way in which they see themselves, and how they muddle through all of that to come to somewhat of an understanding and some sense of peace as to who they are as people and how they came to be that way. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please make sure that you put them down there in the comments section. Our aim with these videos is to not just help you out through giving you some support and some ideas down the camera lens, but also to be really interactive in the comments section. And we'll get back to you if you put anything down there where you feel like you'd like some further clarification or help. Perhaps you'd like to challenge something that I've said today because you see it differently. I'd really welcome that as well, particularly any other ideas or some evidence that you think that we've glossed over. If you've got a lot out of today's video, please like the video and share it with some of your friends. Perhaps they're studying the same pairing or perhaps they're studying a different one. We've got videos for each of the comparative pairs. We're going to have some subsequent videos where we're going to have sample paragraphs and taking you through how to respond to essay questions and traps not to fall into, and shorter videos, not just about this pairing, but also about the Section A texts, as well as language analysis and other exam tips. If you'd like to be kept up to date with all of those things, you can subscribe to the English Labs YouTube channel, and that way you'll receive a notification whenever we upload a new video that'll be there to support you. In the meantime, please leave a comment below with any questions or thoughts or feedback that you might have, and all the best for the rest of your studies.